Dear friends, yes, we are on the threshold of Pentecost. I would like to begin this evening with a reading from the prologue in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So for this evening, I decided to call this happening Logos. And of course, Pentecost is a festival of the Word. But why not just call it Word? Because today we babble and we fight, and these are the words that we're used to. Very often we have lost sight of the Word in a more profound sense. The Greek word logos denotes word, yes, but also rationale, meaning, the creative word of intelligent design. Also the word that moves. We meet the creative word before we even had the word logos, way back in the beginning, in the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I'm always struck by this Spirit of God hovering or moving across the face of the water. At first there is movement, and then there is the word that reverberates. The speaking of the word of the world, everything that is into being, of course, happens in Genesis through the Hebrew language. The Hebrew letters are the elements that construct the universe. It's DNA or pattern, so to speak. The Hebrew letters very much form this DNA, so that the whole world is made up of letters. When God created the various sheep and pigs and birds and so on in Genesis, he brings them to Adam to name them. Adam names them in accordance, not with some arbitrary plucking out of the air of a name, but by really observing them and asking, what is their essential nature? Words, at least in their original sense, and perhaps words in the future also, are of such a nature that they reflect the essential nature of real things. So we can speak about words not as abstract sounds or as a representation for thoughts, but as beings. The original human being before the fall was co-creative. In this naming, we were taking part in God's creation, or trying to come to an understanding of the essential nature of everything that exists. Words are more than are an expression of being rather than just vague ideas or sounds. The Jewish mystic Abraham Abulafia, who came from Spain around 14th, 15th century, held the view that the Hebrew that God used to create the universe is not the same Hebrew that was spoken by the first men and women. The Hebrew of creation is a permutation of letters, pure consonants rather than sentences or mundane language. That this aleph-bet, or what we call alphabet in the West, is the building blocks of all of creation. We have a similar sentiment in the work of Dante Alighieri, the writer of the Divine Comedy, when he speaks about the language used by Adam in paradise as being a different language than the one he uses after the fall. Now, Hebrew is not like our Western languages. We are used to our 7 vowels and our consonants, but Hebrew is what is referred to as an abjad. An abjad is an alphabet in which each letter, each symbol stands for either a consonant or a guttural sound. So there are no true vowels in a way. There are letters that can be used to signify vowel sounds, but for the most part, it is a language of consonants. It leaves it to the reader or to the speaker to infer an appropriate vowel sound. And it also places Hebrew, and actually all of the Semitic languages that developed in this way. You also have this with Arabic, for example, that there's an oral tradition implicit in how one reads these languages, or read these languages, I should say. This, of course, changed. For example, Hebrew now has vowel sounds, but not by adding extra letters, but by adding points around, dots around these words. You have the gesh, which changes the essential sound of a letter, and nekud, which gives us vowel sounds. So Hebrew has fallen from this consonantal language into something much more human and much more Western in terms of how it's spoken, but not completely. So still today, if you go to a synagogue and a child is preparing for this coming of age rite, this bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, the Tanakh, this scroll that they read from, is still a Hebrew that is without the gesh, that is without nekud. So there's actually, it's not something that is meant to be read with vowel sounds, and there is a process of teaching this. So there is oral instruction in how the word is spoken or chanted or sung, because it's not possible to actually read it as we might think of reading in a Western tradition where we have all of our vowels. There's conversation and transmission of an oral tradition. The word is spoken and it moves. It also moves between people as a transmission from generation to generation. Rudolf Steiner describes letter, colour, word, tone, movement, and even the heavenly bodies as having an essential relationship, and that the human being once sang or spoke as a creative act in harmony with everything. But as Alighieri notes, the language of human beings fell, and we lost our connection with this divine or creative word, and to an extent with this divine or creative process. We have in Genesis the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and this awakening. Their eyes were opened and they knew they were naked. They gained self-consciousness. Adam and Eve were able to distinguish themselves from God. As man fell, so too did human language. In humanity, language becomes corrupted as it gets further and further from its divine origin. This process of the fall goes even further in Genesis 11, in the story of the Tower of Babel. People are building a tower to essentially get to heaven, but in a purely materialistic way rather than as a path of development. In this process, the word falls further into confusion. To identify so heavily with a humanity without a reference point to divinity leads humans to division, tribalism, and fighting. So the word has fallen in our time. It's true. But can we find a way to raise the word? We're brought to the mystery of Golgotha when Christ made possible this path of return through sacrifice. We began with the words of John 1, verses 1 to 5. In the beginning was the Word. But John the Evangelist takes a step further. In verse 14, he says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Now, the word that is used by John in the New Testament is the word logos. And logos, as well as being a word for word, has other deeper, I suppose you could say, philosophical or theological connotations. Actually, in Greek, there are lots and lots of different words for word. And this is a very specific word that was chosen for a very specific reason. I mean, we're a bit limited in the English language. We say word, and everything is word, whether it is the creative word, whether it is the word that we speak to each other, whether it is the word that we write on internet walls. But we are speaking here about a word that is a rationality, a design. Would be wrong to say thought, because it's a word that's a being. So Judaism at the time was interpenetrated with the West. We have this entry of Greek philosophy into the Jewish world. We have a number of people who are described as Hellenized Jews. So, for example, all of these writers of the Gospels are writing in Greek, even though they spoke Aramaic, even though they were Jews, they wrote in Greek. And even today, it's very interesting. In Judaism, the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, the only kosher or the only kosher translation, or the only translation that is considered to be a reasonable action to take for this Tanakh, is the translation from Hebrew into Greek. That even the Jews recognize that there is a special quality to the Greek language, and that there is a certain, I suppose, cultural relationship or continuity. So in this Hellenized Israel, this Hellenized Judaism, there was this mixing of philosophy, theology. There was an important philosopher, a Hellenized Jew called Philo. Now Philo adopted the term logos into Jewish philosophy. Philo was essentially a Neoplatonist. He distinguished between the Logos as an uttered word and the word that remains within. He lived from about 20 BC to 50 AD. He used this term Logos and the context in which it entered Judaism is as Logos as sort of a messianic force. So the term Logos was used to describe an intermediary being or demiurge. Philo followed the Platonic distinction between an imperfect material world and the world of perfect form. And these two things aren't so easily reconciled. Therefore, intermediary beings were necessary to bridge the enormous gap between God and the material world, as it was seen within, I suppose, Greek and Platonic philosophy. The Logos was the highest of these intermediary beings and was called by Philo the firstborn of God. So in Christianity, we can begin to see why there's this relationship with Christ and Logos. Why Christ is, as a Redeemer, is so very important. Rudolf Steiner speaks about the spiritual history and destiny of humanity, gives an image, a sweeping image of history and of the development of the human being, from the beginning in an ethereal but sleepy state, a spiritualized state, but not necessarily particularly free or individual, into a more dense existence in which the spiritual world is perhaps not as accessible to us, but in which we can also develop capacities that are seeds for the future. He also described this path of return to an ethereal or spiritual state through conscious engagement. At the crossroads between the fall and the path of return, which we are in the earliest stages of, is the mystery of Golgotha. This bridge between our imperfect nature and the spiritual world allows us the means to return in a renewed and evolved way to our spiritual origins. So where does Pentecost come in all of this? So we come to Pentecost. In many ways, it is a festival of the Word. But it's no longer the Word of God and Adam in this heavenly state, nor just a Word that lives in Christ as Logos, as Redeemer. It takes on a different quality. We have a reading now from Acts 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now, there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language?" So here we begin to get a little bit of a glimpse of a language that reunify human beings for a moment. And one has to wonder, where is that language in our world today? In many ways, Pentecost is still a festival of the future. It is a seed that is planted in us as a potential, but we are also asked to work with that seed, to nurture that seed so that it blossoms, fruits, it grows. We also have to put into context, I suppose, other impediments to this living word as it potentially could live among us, but which didn't quite come to its full fruition at this time. Rudolf Steiner speaks about a period in which the spiritual world would not be as accessible to us, lasting from shortly before the life of Jesus to the end of the 19th century. Over this time, philosophers, occultists, and theologians have looked for a way to refine the creative or divine word. Many have done so through trying to look to Hebrew as the original divine language. But like any human language, this too is fallen. And we as humanity are moving forward. In this time, we could say we lost the word. In one of these movements that try to find the word again, we have this phrase, the lost word. In Freemasonry, they speak about the lost word. In Freemasonry, the lost word is the word of the master, Hiram Abiff, who was killed for not sharing the word and secret of his mastery. This word, the initiate was told, was lost to us. But at the same time, the Mason did not abandon his striving or his work or this process of development. He worked so as an aspiration, one day this lost word could be recovered through continuing striving and work. Freemasonry in many ways is something of the past, but this idea of a lost word that can be refound is something that is very relevant for our time. It is a day that is now dawning. Since the late 19th century, the possibility of a new connection and rediscovery of the divine creative world has become possible and became a central mission of Rudolf Steiner and also importantly, Maurice Steiner. We don't speak so much about Maurice Steiner because there is some difficult history. However, when it comes to this re-enlivening of the word, we must very strongly look to her influence. We find the enlivened word through the arts, through the mystery dramas, through the frozen morphology or sense of movement in anthroposophical architecture, through formative or creative speech, and through eurythmy. Even the name of the Goetheanum, the spiritual home and mystery temple of anthroposophy, was originally the house of the word. Now, particularly significant in this, because architecture is something that existed before and speech and drama were something that lived before, but something that's particularly new and significant in our time is the art of movement out of the dynamic word, this art of eurythmy. In 1924, towards the end of his life, Rudolf Steiner returned to the question of the creative moving word in a lecture cycle called Eurythmia's Visible Speech. He pointed to the prologue of the John Gospel that understands the word as a spiritual reality and not just a symbol. As Steiner speaks about the primitive or primeval human being that had a special understanding, a special conception of the word, and that understanding lived within them, that the whole human being was an etheric creation. Steiner describes the etheric body as an immensely complex organism that is constantly in motion. He describes how this activity is also in the sounds of speech, so that when we speak, the gestures of the etheric body are imprinted invisibly on the air. Each sound of the alphabet produces in the air its own particular form, which is a picture of a movement in the human etheric body. Now, it took me a long time to appreciate eurythmy, I must say. I don't have a Waldorf education.
I didn't like it at first either, so don't worry.
I didn't have a Waldorf education, and my first encounter was seeing performance eurythmy, and I looked at it and went, that's a bit strange. But, I'm also educated in Camp Hill, which means you do what you're told to do, and I got to do some eurythmy, and there's probably no better way to start your day than to do a bit of eurythmy in the morning, because it looks ridiculous, and at first it feels a little bit ridiculous, but if you do that for a little bit of time, you don't just walk into the world, you skip into the world, you float a little bit into the world. You are a little bit more lively and a bit lighter. So this understanding of the word as movement, as activity, as excited possibility, forms the basis for speech eurythmy, which is the making visible of the etheric creation through movement and gesture. Rudolf Steiner goes further. You remember this first words of Genesis where God moved upon the face of the waters. Rudolf Steiner describes the human being coming out of the eurythmy of the gods. He says, God eurythmizes. And as a result of his eurythmy, there arises the human form. This is one of the central tasks of eurythmy, to bring the human being into a direct relationship with the divine creative activity that fashions the human form and all existence. Through eurythmy and speech formation as etheric or enlivened word, we can begin to experience ourselves as co-creators, as being endowed with the logos, the word. Through eurythmy, we can begin to perceive a future in which humanity will one day speak and create out of the power of the word. And Rudolf Steiner very much speaks about this as our next step, that there will come a time in which a human being's primary creative impulse will be out of the word. But for now, some of our words are fallen, some of our words work towards being redeemed. But we stand on a threshold on our path of return, at the edge of the spiritual world, and we're making these most tentative beginnings of stirring words that create. We create art, we engender community through social art, and hopefully we begin to create true conversation. I hope we're now a little bit closer to this elusive word. It seems to me to be a moving, acting, inspiring word we can only begin to grasp hold of. I would like to turn finally to Central Europe and the translation of the Bible into German. In the German language, of course, the Bible was translated by Martin Luther. And when he was translating the Bible into German, he had a choice. It's quite a famous choice. He could either translate logos as word or as deed. And Martin Luther chose to translate it as word. And people in various translations have been struggling with this. For example, in the French, in some translations, you have word translated as le verbe.
I know it as la parole, and it's la, feminine. So
nice. So this is technically correct. It is the word. Logos is the word. And while it's technically correct, it doesn't adequately convey the dynamic, moving quality of this creative word. But another impulse arose in Central Europe that tried to fix this. In Goethe's Faust, when Dr. Faust also has a go at translating the Bible into German. So he opens his book and he faces this dilemma of what am I going to translate this particular word as? But he's moved by the spiritual world to find a different word to describe the word. So I will finish today with the words from Act 1, Scene 3 of Goethe's Faust, after he's opened his Bible and is trying to find a word for word. It says, "In the beginning was the Word." Already I am stopped. It seems absurd. The Word does not deserve the highest praise. I must translate it otherwise. If I am well inspired and not blind. It says, "In the beginning was the mind." Ponder that first line. Wait and see, lest you should write too hastily. Is mind the all-creating source? It ought to say, "In the beginning was the force." Yet something warns me as I grasp the pen that my translation must be changed again. The Spirit helps me. Now it is exact. I write, "In the beginning was the deed." So yes, that's where I wanted to get to this evening. So thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Brian. That's lovely.